So my name is Judith Rosenbaum. I am the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm delighted to be with you here this evening in Israel. It's afternoon here in Boston. I am trained as a historian, but I work in the field of public history. That is history that is oriented towards the public, towards educating the general public and engaging the general public in the kind of scholarship that often lives in the academy. The organization that I run, the Jewish Women's Archive, is a digital archive. We were founded in the early days of the internet and have been growing and adapting along with it. I've been lucky to be the CEO for the last 7 years, but have been involved really since the early days, about 21 years ago when I was a graduate student and found my way there. And I have stayed engaged because I'm passionate about history, passionate about Jewish community and women's stories, and I believe that history matters. And so that is part of what we're going to talk about today. I'm excited to share with you some of the work of the Jewish Women's Archive and also to talk a little bit about why we do that work. So as I said, we began as a digital archive in the mid-90s, really in the early days of the internet, because we had a vision that an archive could be transformed to be a different kind of place for the 21st century. Our mission is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agent of change. And unlike in a traditional archive, we emphasize access. We emphasize the idea that history belongs to everyone. It belongs to you, and should therefore not be locked up in a place where, most people think of archives as places that are not open to everyone. They're really meant for specialists. Sometimes you need specific credentials to get in. But we wanted an archive that people would feel belonged to them, that was really democratized, and where history could be engaged with and could be played with and could be accessed from your couch and from your living room and from your classroom, and would be accessible in a really radical way. And why was that important to us? Because history can be a very powerful tool for social change. History is the study of how change is made, and we need to know what came before us to be able to build on it better. So JWA takes all the stuff of history that scholars produce, and we work with scholars all over the world, and we use that material to create new resources that are for many different audiences: educational resources, online exhibitions, public programs, virtual programs, a blog, a podcast, a teen leadership program. And all of that is geared towards engaging people in the stuff of history, helping them understand themselves as part of the historical narrative and as historical actors who are going to continue to make history and bring it forward. So I want to begin, I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about what history is. And let me get that up here just a second. Okay, so what is history? One of the things I like to begin by teaching is a quote from Rosa Sonnenschein. Sonnenschein was a writer, a community leader in St. Louis in the late 19th century. And she became the editor. She created the first English language publication for American Jewish women called The American Jewess, which she published from 1895 to 1899, and which JWA has digitized and made accessible online. And one of the things that she wrote in her opening editorial was, "Not what has happened, but what is recorded makes history." She understood that first of all, history is made every day, but that the record of what history actually is that which is recorded, and that's what people begin to know and remember as history, and that's the history that goes on to shape who we are. And that's part of why it was important for her to create a written record of the issues that mattered to American Jewish women in her time at the end of the 19th century. And the magazine addressed a wide range of issues, from whether it was okay for women to ride bicycles to early reflections on Zionism. It really ran the gamut, and it gave a sense of the kind of richness and diversity of Jewish women's lives at that period. But I think that her reminder is still quite relevant today, because we recognize that if we do not document Jewish women's stories and, make sure that they are part of the historical narrative that we engage with and that we teach, we are going to grow up without a sense of the fullness of history. And we want people to grow up, people of all genders to grow up with a knowledge of their full heritage, which includes the contributions and experiences of people of all genders. And when we think about this, particularly in a Jewish context, I also like to, share this quote from Letty Cotton Pogrebin. Why is this project particularly important in a Jewish context? The Jewish community places a great deal of emphasis on history, but actually we only talk about a very narrow slice of it. And that slice does not usually include the experiences of Jewish women, except perhaps as mothers. So as Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who was a pioneering Jewish feminist, put very clearly, she said, for a people whose ethos, whose very identity is founded in remembering, we have forgotten too much about Jewish women. For a community that calls itself the people of the book, we have left too many pages blank. And this, in many ways, I think, serves as a very clear need statement for what why JWA was founded. JWA was founded to fill those pages, to say that actually that book is bursting with stories, and we need to put them back into the story, and in fact, begin to fill out our narrative and to expand it. I would say that the thing I hear most often when I teach and give presentations is just, a kind of surprise. Why didn't I learn this? Why didn't I know this? And JWA was founded so that there would be no excuse for people to leave women out when they talk about about Jewish history, because we would be making all of these stories available at people's fingertips. And then I think there's the question of like, why does it matter whether people know those stories or not? Why does history matter at all? And I want to share one more quotation from another Jewish woman, Gerda Lerner, who was a pioneering historian and historian of women. She was also a Jewish refugee from Austria. And her approach to history was very much shaped by her understanding of the importance of history to Jews, and looking at how much it mattered to Jews to know their history and to value it, and that helped Jews kind of feel a sense of community and strength throughout the generations. She wrote, "We live our lives, we tell our stories. The past becomes part of our present and thereby part of our future. We act individually and collectively in a process over time, which builds the human enterprise and tries to give it meaning. We experience, we give voice to that experience, others reflect on it and give it new form. That new form in turn influences and shapes the way new generations experience their lives." In other words, history is not just about the past. It shapes how we understand ourselves, how we understand the world, and how we understand what is possible both in the present and in the future. It shapes our sense of who we can be. One of our favorite kind of dictums at the Jewish Women's Archive is, if you can see it, you can be it. In other words, if we have role models for possibilities of what we can become, it vastly expands our sense of what capacity we have. History gives us concrete stories on which to hang our ideas and our own experiences of the world. And as I said earlier, it can be an important tool for social change. History is the study of how change is made. And so we need to know what came before to build on it and to make progress. One of the other important insights that Gerda Lerner shared was that including women's stories is not just an additive process. It doesn't just add to the story, it changes the story. It helps us understand it differently. So to go back to Letty Pogrebin's statement about filling in the blank pages, it's not just that when we add those pages to the book has more, is fuller and has more stories, but actually the whole story is changed by including women's stories. When we incorporate Jewish women's perspectives and experiences, we find that it can shift the narrative in significant ways. And so what I want to do today is share a little bit about JWA's history and development with stories at the center, and to use some of those stories to illustrate the ways that knowing Jewish women's history can change the way we understand history more broadly. Okay. So I'm going to start with one of our early projects, which was a poster series that we created from 1997 to 2003, called the Women of Valor posters. And so even though we started online, we knew that it was going to be a while, given that we were in the early days of the internet, before we could really penetrate, and we needed to get people's attentions. And we also were looking around at the institutions in our world and saw that when you walk through them, it was very, very clear. When you walk through institutions, what do you see on the walls? You see the faces of the people who have led those institutions. And you can walk through so many institutions and just see male face, male face, male face, male face. You have no idea that actually much of the work of keeping those institutions running day by day is actually done by women. You would never know that from looking at the pictures that line the hallways. And so we wanted to put women onto the walls of our institutions. And so we created a poster series, which we sent to synagogues, schools, JCCs, libraries, all different kinds of institutions across North America. They were used in many different creative ways, and that brought us into our work with educators. And they were also a kind of stealth curriculum. That was what one of our funders called them. They were a way to learn by absorbing the information on the wall. So, you might have kids lining up in the hallway to go to lunch. And if the hallway was lined with these posters that had not just images of these women, but a timeline and little stories, it might be something that over the course of months might sort of seep in a little bit. Or one of my favorite stories was that I taught, while I was finishing my PhD, I taught US history at a day school, at a high school. And I put these posters up around my room. And at the end of the year, when a couple of my students came to me and thanked me for the course and how much they learned and how it changed their understanding of history, they said, "I always picture you with Bella Abzug over your shoulder." Right. And that was because Bella Abzug, who was an amazing politician and activist and congresswoman, the poster of her was posted behind me. So it was literally over my shoulder. But it felt to me also like a metaphor for what I wanted these students to understand, which is that each of us is coming to whatever we do in the world with these people behind us who inform us and who inspire us and who in some way sort of protect us. And so that image to me was exactly what we wanted to have happen with the posters. So here I'm showing two of the posters, Henrietta Szold and Anna Sokolow. And I picked those two because I think that they represent different kinds of ways that we're trying to bring women's stories back into history. So Henrietta Szold is someone who is probably, if you ask people to name Jewish women, she would be one of the ones who they might be able to actually name. And she's very much owned by Jewish history. She's most famous, of course, as the founder of Hadassah. But when we told her story, we felt it was important to make clear that her story is actually much bigger than that. I mean, not that you need to be bigger than the founder of Hadassah, but that there was so much more there that gives kind of richer context to her life. She was born in Baltimore in 1860. She was the oldest daughter of a rabbi who had only daughters, so he educated her as he would have educated a son. So she was quite knowledgeable and comfortable with, Jewish text and Jewish learning. She became an educator both in the secular world and also with the Russian refugee population, which was really growing at the time. And she also became a writer who published essays on the Jewish issues of the day. So for example, she published her first essay on Zionism in 1896, 1 month actually before Theodor Herzl published his first Zionist writing. So she was very much in the mix of what were the important issues of the time. She became the head of the Jewish Publication Society, and as an editor and translator in that capacity, she influenced Jewish scholarship. She traveled to Palestine for the first time in 1909 when she was in her late 40s. So, that part of her life really was the second half of her life. She was shocked by the poverty and disease that she saw there, and she returned to the US really determined to organize Jewish women to help. And that led her to found Hadassah, which she initially had conceived of as a study group, but very quickly became a kind of organizing and activist group. And of course, through Hadassah, she built the medical, educational, and social services infrastructure of the Yishuv and then of the state of Israel. And she made Aliyah in 1920 at age 59. One of the other things that was a very important lasting impact was her work in Youth Aliyah. Youth Aliyah saved about 11,000 children, I believe, from Nazi Europe. And that was a program that she helped to found and run. And I think when we know her fuller story, there also are personal aspects of her story, the frustrations that she found as a single woman trying to do this work, the importance of her larger family and how much caretaking she did of her larger family. Also, some of her her own, sort of radical ideas. One of the things that she's known for is that when her mother died in 1916, she insisted on saying Kaddish for her, even though it was very much not part of traditional practice for women to say Kaddish at the time. And she had a very beautiful letter in which she explained why that was important. So when we know her fuller story, we can understand more about the social context of the time and how she came to influence Zionism and the state of Israel, and where gender fits into that story. Anna Sokolow is a bit of a different figure. She was a choreographer and a dancer. She's very well known in the world of modern dance, much less well known in Jewish context, though she actually found quite a bit of inspiration in Jewish history and culture and had a big impact on dance in Israel. She was born in the US to immigrant parents in 1910, switch the slides there. She began dancing as a young person. There were some wonderful after-school programs in Manhattan for immigrants that were meant for immigrant communities. And she was able to join the neighborhood playhouse school in her teens, where she encountered really the leading lights of early modern dance. She trained there with Martha Graham and joined Martha Graham's professional dance company in the late 20s and stayed with her for about 10 years. But she began, even while she was in Graham's company, to choreograph and to become associated with the radical dance movement. The radical dancers saw their art as a form of activism and as a way to inspire their audience to engage with contemporary issues. So Sokolow created dances that were arguing against war, which was her piece Anti-War Trilogy was performed at the 1933 First Anti-War Congress, for example. And she used dance as a way of addressing many of the issues that were part of the conversation in the 30s. By the mid-1930s, she was the youngest American choreographer to lead her own professional dance group. And in that capacity, she was invited to Mexico, where she was an immediate success. And she stayed in Mexico to help create a government-sponsored modern dance company. And her work there had a huge impact and actually set this foundation for an indigenous Mexican modern dance music. Her work in Mexico also influenced her own artistic development. And for about a decade, she commuted between Mexico and New York. And interestingly, it was her experience in Mexico that began to turn her more towards Jewish themes in her work. She often explored themes of exile and of suffering. She created pieces in the mid-40s about the Holocaust. And she also created pieces that focused on women like Miriam and Devorah, Hannah Senesh, Golda Meir. She was very interested in these questions of representing women's leadership, women's bodies in her dance. You can see in these pictures some of the images from both a piece called The Exile and a piece called Kaddish. Beginning in the 1950s, Sokolow also began to influence Israeli dance. She worked with the Yemenite Inbal Dance Theater, returned every summer for decades. She also created her own company, the Lyric Theater in Israel in the 1960s. She, at the same time, was choreographing for plays on and off Broadway and working as a teacher with the Group Theater and the Actors Studio and Juilliard. So through her workshops around the world, she really shaped generations of dancers and actors and left her mark on students and colleagues. And I bring her story because I think, it's an interesting question, what happens to Jewish history when we see the influence of a Jewish dancer and choreographer on the field of modern dance? How do we take that field and begin to look at it through a Jewish lens and begin to think about what the cultural story is of Jews and Judaism within fields like dance and other art fields? One of the things that happened when we created these very rich posters and the resource guides that went around with them is we started to work with educators and found that teachers were very interested in how do they take these stories, how do they take the primary sources that we had uncovered and use them in the classroom. And so that sent us on a whole path of working with teachers, teaching them how to teach history, how to use historical documents, how to bring women's stories into their teaching. And so I want to give you a couple examples of what that could look like. And so we created a whole series of lesson plans that drew on primary source material and built from it. And this for us was part of expanding what's considered a Jewish text, not just classical Jewish texts like Torah and rabbinics, but also looking at things like letters, memoirs, photographs, recipes, speeches, thinking about those as Jewish texts that we could bring our Jewish text skills to, and developing teacher training programs to go along with it, along with lessons for kids, for adults, for families. We also created some larger curricula as well as standalone pieces. So one of the short pieces that I want to share just draws on the story of Tzippi Porat. I don't know if people have heard of her. She was a young American who came to Jerusalem in 1947 to study at Hebrew University. When the war broke out, the Independence War, she joined the Haganah. She served as a medic during the siege of Jerusalem, later in an intelligence unit for the Air Force. And the reason we know her story is because she wrote letters home, in which she talked about her experience, first just as a student coming to Israel, a young Zionist who was very excited to be there, and then as her story got swept into the story of the founding of the State of Israel, describing some of that experience. So we chose a few of her letters, describing Kaftet November, describing the vote on the partition plan and what happened afterwards. And I want to share one. This is a picture of her from that day of holding the newspaper headline. But we chose a piece from a letter of hers. This is from December 7th, 1947. And she wrote about how they were feeling. She said, the morale of the Jewish community in Palestine is fantastic. Unity and purposefulness pervade everything. Every single person is caught up in the needs of the hour. I can tell you I wouldn't have missed this experience for a lifetime of illusions about Zionism and Palestine lived in the quiet of New York. You are part of a struggle that is bigger than your own individual striving for self-attainment and self-preservation. There is an overpowering sense of belonging, of being needed, and of being wanted, a commitment you cannot reject. Some of her letters were much more sober, describing some of the hardships of being under siege, describing eventually beginning to write about some of her work with the Haganah, writing about many of her friends who were killed during the fighting. But Tzippi stayed, and she came back to the States briefly. She worked for the Consul General in New York, where actually she married an Israeli who was working at the consulate as well. They came back to Israel and had 2 sons. And Tzippi actually just died a few months ago. I had the opportunity to speak with her before she died, a little bit about her story and about developing lesson plans around her stories. What we found is that telling the story of a young person in the midst of those moments allows students to enter into the history of the founding of the State of Israel through this one story of a young woman, through her eyes, through her experience, through what it was like to be a woman in the midst of fighting, where gender came into that, where being an American in an Israeli context came into that. And it's a powerful experience for our students. So that's taking one woman's story, one document even, and beginning to weave out a lesson from that. A larger story, a much larger story, is the story of Jewish women and labor activism. And this is a story that we love to teach. And one of our early posters was on Rose Schneiderman, and she's the one on the left of the slide. And when we developed our first curriculum, we included her story and other labor activists because this was an example of a movement where Jewish women really changed the course of history. We later developed an entire curriculum on Jews and social justice called Living the Legacy. And in that, we included a large section on Jews and the labor movement. Because it was a place where we just see how the American Jewish story changed American history and changed the nature of the whole movement. Of course, it wasn't only Jews, there were other immigrant groups involved, and not only women, but Jewish women made a particular contribution. So when we talk about the garment industry, it was such an obvious case of Jews shaping American society and a major social change movement. And the garment industry was a particular focus for this because in the early 20th century, in the urban context, which is where most Jewish immigrants lived in the Northeast, most women operated a sewing machine in a garment factory at some point in their young adult lives. This, is because it was easier for girls to get jobs than for their fathers to get jobs. So they were likely to become workers at a younger age. And that had a very big impact on the whole nature of the immigrant experience. But these were difficult circumstances. Women worked very long hours at very low wages in unsanitary and unsafe working conditions. They faced continual harassment. There was no minimum wage. There was no overtime pay. Girls and women were regularly paid less than men for doing the same jobs. Wages were deducted for all kinds of reasons. If you came late, if your machinery broke, if you needed to go to the bathroom without permission, if you weren't working fast enough, for lots of reasons beyond the control of the worker. Workers often had to provide their own machinery and supplies. And there were no laws to protect children in the workplace. There was no, occupational safety and health administration overseeing conditions. The lighting was poor, sanitation was poor. It was hot in the summer, it was cold in the winter. The doors were locked, the noise was loud. There was a great deal of sexual abuse, which was rarely reported or punished. But it was just, those were the conditions that people were living with. Now, you can understand based on that why workers might organize. Of course, change did not happen easily. It came about because of the skilled leadership of Jewish women like Rose Schneiderman and her cohort. It included other women like Pauline Newman and Clara Lemlich. And they really proved that women could be organized and could help build the labor movement. There was a growing labor movement at this time. Working men had been organizing themselves into unions in the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, there were in the garment industry unions of various sorts, needle trade workers and cloak makers and cloth hat and cap makers union. And the unions negotiated pay rates and working hours and some conditions for members, but women were not included in the union. And so they did not benefit from the collective bargaining between unions and managers on behalf of male workers. Why were women not part of the unions? Because male leaders mistakenly assumed that women would not be interested in joining the union because they would only work for a few years until they got married and therefore might not be committed to improving the workplace. What they didn't understand, they really underestimated working women's ability to take themselves and their work seriously and to see themselves as part of a community that was invested in the conditions of the workplace, so that even if they were not themselves going to be working in the factories for their whole lifetime, they would be part of families that had people working in those factories. So despite the lack of support from male union leaders, women were aware of the benefits and protections that unions offered, and they began to organize themselves. And despite the hardships that they found around them, which as I detailed before, were quite overwhelming, they also found a lot of strength in their peers and in their communities. That this became a really important part of these young women's coming of age experience and that part of their becoming Americans. Some of them, of course, came already with political training and experience. Some of them had encountered radical political movements in Europe, and so they were maybe more open to ideas like unionism and socialism when they arrived in the US. For some Jewish girls and women, they also connected their oppression in the workplace to the political oppression that had inspired their families to come to America. And they really believed that America was a place where they were supposed to experience greater freedom and better conditions. And so therefore they were willing to really demand that because they felt that that was what the promise of America was. They also believed in the possibility of change in America. They believed that they could help bring about that betterment of their conditions through activism. And so that brought these young women to advocate for and really change the whole system of the labor movement to find a place for themselves. So just to go back to Rose Schneiderman, since we have her on the screen, and she's just one example. She began working at age 13 after the death of her father. She began her union activism as a cap maker. She noticed pretty quickly that the highest paid jobs were reserved for men. Her older colleagues explained that men belonged to the union and that was why they had better conditions. So she went to the United Cloth Hat and Cap Makers Union to request union recognition for the trimmers and lining makers. Those were women's jobs, making the lining and trimming the finished products. The officials of the unions were, skeptical that it was possible to organize women. So they sort of said, sure, if you can gather the names of 25 women, you can have this local. And guess what? Rose did that within just a few days. And she became the secretary of their new local. And she really found her calling. And this is what she spent her life doing. So in 1905, the Cap Makers Union called for a general strike. She was the only woman leader in the union, so she got a lot of press and respect from the male Cap members when she was able to rally women into the strike. This also brought her to the attention of the Women's Trade Union League, which was a middle and upper class women's organization that wanted to help working women. And so she worked with them and really in part changed the model of their organization and became a vice president there pretty quickly. And she cultivated the leadership of women workers by putting them in charge of their own strikes instead of putting men in charge of their strikes. So that's sort of some of the background of what she was building. The same kinds of things were happening throughout the garment industry. Her friend Clara Lemlich had been organizing shirtwaist makers. And in 1909, a big wave of strikes began. And Lemlich and Schneiderman had been very involved in trying to organize some of those strikes. And this is what became the uprising of the 20,000. There were these individual strikes, and there was a big question about whether they should all join together into a general strike. And so the International Ladies Garment Workers Union decided to hold a general meeting on November 22nd, and they had all of their leading guys ready to speak. And each of them got up there and spoke about terrible conditions, but didn't really offer any concrete solutions. And so Clara Lemlich, this young woman, hops up on the stage. She was not one of the invited speakers. And she said, you know, I'm so frustrated with the fact that everybody is speaking and not moving us forward in any way. And she said, if you're with me, let's go out on strike, everybody, let's take the Jewish oath. And everybody, you know, stood up and raised their right hand and pledged their support to the union. You know, if I forget the O Jerusalem, but if I forget the union. And her speech sparked the uprising of the 20,000, the largest strike of women to that time. Overnight, somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 workers, most of them teenage girls, most of them Jewish, walked off their jobs in protest of low wages, long hours, dangerous conditions. Again, this wasn't, you know, there was this moment of excitement that Clara Lemlich helped leverage, but it wasn't a spontaneous uprising. It was based on about 3 years of organizing, but it did spread to cities from the New York through the Midwest. And it really was the moment at which the male labor leaders had to reassess the role of women in the labor movement. It was a difficult strike. It was very cold weather, and women were, you know, out on the street marching. The bosses tried to divide workers by ethnic group, by hiring prostitutes to infiltrate picket lines, and, you know, by hiring thugs to beat strikers, and then police would arrest the strikers for being disruptive. Wealthy women came and joined the strike lines, what they called mink brigades, that brought wealthy women and college students onto the picket line, which helped restrain the police because they were less likely to, you know, slap handcuffs on someone if that person might turn out to have a rich father. It also got some press for the strikers. The strike lasted 11 weeks, still the largest strike of women workers in history. They won a portion of their demands, but more importantly, it sparked about 5 years of revolt that really transformed the garment industry into one of the best organized trades in the US. Most shops won a 52-hour work week, some holidays with pay, negotiation of wages, various other rights. By the end of the strike, 85% of all the shirtwaist makers in New York had joined the ILGWU. Local 25, which began the strike with 100 members, now had 10,000. Less tangible, but I think equally important, is that the strike convinced male leaders to accept women as capable union activists, and it showed the women their own self-worth. And so many of the women who were part of that strike carried that knowledge with them into the other things that they did, whether it was staying in the labor movement like Rose Schneiderman did, you know, and kind of continuing to organize, whether it was you know, marrying, having children, and organizing the women in your neighborhood to protest something, whether it was training their daughters to go on to protest in various ways. But one of the other insights that came about from working from these women workers was in helping unions understand the importance of bread and roses, this concept of bread and roses. And this was something that Rose Schneiderman is famous for. The origin of the term is actually a little bit unclear. It was used a number of times around 1911, 1912, but Rhoda Schneiderman used it in a speech in the context of a women's suffrage campaign in 1912. And she said to these women, she was speaking to middle and upper class women about working women. She said, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life, as the rich woman has the right to life, and the sun and music and art. You have nothing that the humblest worker has not a right to have also. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too." And she meant by this, of course, you know, that of course, unions and the labor movement and all should fight for the very basics of survival, but that also part of what they needed to be fighting for was a sense of dignity, the other things that humans deserve, beautiful things, flowers, you know, a nice hat, the opportunity to get an education, the opportunity to go to the theater, the kinds of things that feed your soul, not just your body. And that was part of the new idealism and energy that women brought to unionism, a recognition of some of women's particular needs, as well as, you know, a sort of broader sense of what made for a meaningful life. And so they would, they fought for certain kinds of things that hadn't been part of the union movement before then, things like offering educational programs in literature and politics, things like social and cultural programs like dances and concerts, even opportunities to get out of the city and enjoy vacations in the country at union-run camps. And one of the things that what you see on this slide is both in the picture on the upper right is from a union production, a theater production that the union did. And from the lower left is from a camp where there were, you know, lectures and educational opportunities. And, you know, so that was a really important piece of what Jewish women brought and changed in the whole labor movement. So I wanted to share a little bit of that. The next piece that I want to talk about is sort of the expansion of JWA's collection. We began with a focus on North America. We needed to start somewhere, of course, but in 2009, we brought onto our site the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, making it free and accessible to anyone. Before it had been available on CD-ROM. And that opened up our site to global stories because the encyclopedia covers Jewish women around the world, Bible to present, and allowed us to tell stories that hadn't been on our site before. Like, for example, one of the stories I love is of Asnat Barazani, who was a head of a yeshiva in Kurdistan as a woman in the 16th century. Her father had built a yeshiva in Mosul. He had no son, so he trained his daughter to be a scholar. You'll see that might be a little bit of a theme throughout this here. We know about her because she wrote letters which survived and because there are stories about her in folklore. And when she married one of her father's students, her father made him agree that she would not have to work so that she could remain studying. And so while her husband was studying, she would teach some students. And after her father died, her husband technically became the head of the yeshiva, but she continued to do the teaching. And when her husband died, she became the official leader of the yeshiva. So there were all kinds of stories about her, you know, giving her supernatural powers. But, you know, to tell the story of a young woman who had this kind of role that we did not imagine women had hundreds of years ago can change our understanding of like, what really did leadership look like, right? And what were the opportunities for women and why did some women have these extremely unusual opportunities? I'm not saying these stories were frequent, but knowing that they existed at all changes how we think about, for example, women as rabbis today or women as teachers of holy text today. In June, we launched a new edition of the encyclopedia with hundreds of revised and new essays, which we developed in partnership with our editorial board of about 60 scholars from around the world. And we focused the expansion particularly on these previously underrepresented topics like Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, LGBTQ Jews, Jews from the Global South, and we will be continuing to add over time. And when we look at a topic globally and over time, we can look at a topic like women's leadership, for example, in new ways. And so I want to compare that story of Asnat Barazani with some of the stories from our collection on women rabbis. This is one of our newer collections. It features video interviews with 75 rabbis from Israel, England, Poland, Germany, France, the US, and Canada. And it highlights pioneers of all kinds. So on the left, you have Rabbi Sally Priesand, who this spring will celebrate her 50th anniversary since becoming the first American woman to be ordained as a rabbi. She, of course, originally, when she applied to rabbinical school, they tried to redirect her to be an educator. They said, oh, don't you really mean that you want to apply to the education school? And maybe you should talk to your rabbi about this. And we have on our site one of the letters that she received from the school trying to kind of redirect her. Some people thought she wanted to go to rabbinical school to marry a rabbi. In the middle is Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, the first Asian American rabbi who struggled throughout her young Jewish life with being told that she wasn't really Jewish. And she, by being a leader, has transformed people's vision of what a rabbi looks like, what a Jew looks like. Now she's the senior rabbi at a major Reform congregation in New York City that has been really reckoning with some of the history of sexual abuse and harassment within the rabbinate and is bringing those issues to light in a new way. And I think it's not accidental that it takes having a woman in the top seat to begin to address those issues and really reckon with them. And on the left is Rabbi Claudia Kramen, who's also happens to be my rabbi and my close friend. She is the daughter of a conservative rabbi who was the chief rabbi of Chile, and a mother who was killed very tragically in the 1994 bombing of the Jewish Center in Buenos Aires. Rabbi Kramen studied both at the Seminario in Argentina, then made Aliyah and got rabbinic ordination at the Schechter Institute for Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, worked in Israel for several years for the Noam youth movement, and then moved to the US, where she's a rabbi in Boston. And she's such an interesting example of someone who brings both Latin American and Israeli culture to her rabbinate in America, and really represents that kind of global nature of women's leadership today. So within our collection on women rabbis, we not only have profiles of individual rabbis, but also thematic sections that explore some of the common themes within their very diverse experiences. And we also put that story within, the story of women's rabbinic leadership today into conversation with a lost story, that of Regina Jonas. Regina Jonas was really the first modern woman rabbi. She was born in 1902 into an Orthodox family in Berlin. As a young girl, she had a dream of becoming a rabbi. We don't really know where she got that idea from, but she talked about it even as a girl of 11. During the 1920s, she studied at the Academy for the Science of Judaism, taking all the same courses and exams required of male rabbinical students, though it was made clear to her that it was very unlikely that she would be able to be ordained. She eventually found a teacher who was willing to consider ordaining her. She wrote her rabbinic dissertation on the topic, "Can Women Serve as Rabbis?" And this paper, submitted in 1930, is the first known attempt to find a halachic basis for the ordination of women. The faculty member who was ready to ordain her died suddenly. And the institution then decided only to grant her the degree of academic teacher of religion. And so for several years, she taught religion at girls' schools in Berlin. And finally, in 1935, she was ordained as a rabbi, representing the Association of Liberal Rabbis in Berlin. And at first, she was invited to work in schools and hospitals and nursing homes. But in that timing, as many rabbis were fleeing the country or were deported, and there were more unmet needs, she began to have opportunities to serve in synagogues who were desperate for rabbinic leadership. Regina Jonas was deported to Theresen in November of 1942, and very smartly, before being deported, she gave her documents to the Berlin Jewish community for safekeeping, where they actually were saved, although were lost behind the Berlin Wall. She functioned in Theresienstadt as a rabbi for 2 years, teaching, giving pastoral care. In the archives of Theresienstadt is a handwritten document that lists 24 topics for lectures she gave under the heading, "Lectures by the Only Female Rabbi, Regina Jonas." She and her mother were deported to Auschwitz on October 12, 1944, and murdered there shortly thereafter. And then, strangely, she was forgotten, despite the fact that people who knew her, many people who knew her, survived. In fact, important people, famous people like Leo Baeck and Viktor Frankl, who she knew well and had worked with, survived, but her story was not the story that they told. And her papers were lost behind the Berlin Wall until 1991, when they were rediscovered by scholars. So strangely, her story was written out of history twice. Once because the Nazis robbed her of her life, and again because the post-war Jewish community was really not ready to hear or celebrate her story. And it was only in the 90s, when her papers were rediscovered, that women in the rabbinate today could understand that actually they weren't entirely new, that there was someone who had been there before. And that, that was part of the heritage that they were building on. No one said Kaddish for her until 2014, when a group of rabbis and scholars that the Jewish Women's Archive and the American Jewish Archive organized on a trip to Berlin and Prague in Jonas's footsteps, decided that they were going to create an official yahrzeit for her, which is Shabbat Bereshit. And we have a photo here. The photo on the right is of the first 3 American women rabbis, Sally Priesand, Sally Eisenberg-Sasso, and Amy Eilberg, with a picture of Regina Jonas in Europe. And I think, again, bringing that story back in changes our understanding of what it means to be a female rabbi today, knowing that there was a female rabbi in 1935 whose story was forgotten. So knowing both of her existence and the story of the forgetting of her existence, I think is an important piece of that. The last thing I want to talk about is the importance of oral history. And this has been a really big piece of JWA's work from the beginning. And I bring you here a short quote from Barbara Meyerhoff, who was an important anthropologist and filmmaker, who said, "Everyone has a story. These stories told to oneself and others can transform the world." And we love to work with oral history because it's an important piece of our work in democratizing history and capturing both the stories that haven't been written down and the stories of quote unquote ordinary people, the stories of daily life. We need these stories because when you take the particulars of individual experiences together, it creates a very different image of human experience. We don't want to just recreate the kind of male model of history of just, kind of heroes and individual greats. We want to have the sense of like, what does daily life look like? Who makes history is made not just by the famous people, but by all the people who are doing their daily work and living their lives. And so we've done many different projects over the years, some capturing life histories of women whose lives span the 20th century. We did a project like that in Boston and in New York, Boston and Baltimore and Seattle. We've collected stories of activists. We also did and I'm showing you here some photos from exhibits that we did based in Baltimore and Seattle. And then we also did a big project in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The New Orleans community has a very old and unique Jewish community. And so we studied the impact of that storm in that community and how they responded. And, just to give you a sense of some of the variety, these are just two of the women from the Weaving Women's Words project in Baltimore and Seattle. On the left, you have Dr. Ruth Finkelstein, who is not a household name, but was a pioneer in women's health. She was a beloved doctor for generations of Baltimore women, and she promoted women's health and reproductive rights over a career that spanned half a century. It's a story both of having opportunities to study and also being limited in what she was allowed to study because of her gender. So she wasn't allowed to study surgery. She ended up in obstetrics and gynecology, but that led her to be able to be on the forefront of family planning issues and working with the kind of forerunner of Planned Parenthood and really creating a program on reproductive health for women for years. And on the right, you have Louise AZOSE, who was born into a rabbinic Sephardic family in Bursa, Turkey, came to Seattle in 1927 with her family, and really became a keeper of Seattle's Sephardic community, a keeper of traditions, of history, of recipes, of faith, of folk songs, and her oral history is just filled with Ladino and filled with song and with recipes. And so it gives you a sense of just the kind of richness that you can get from oral history. Today, we're doing our oral history work a little bit differently. We've created a mobile app called Story Aperture that we use to engage the public as our partners in collecting history. We really we had created a beautiful oral history guide, which many people use, but also people find it very intimidating to know how to enter into oral history. And so we wanted to kind of lower the bar by creating question sets for focused short interviews to say you could start with just a few questions, with just one story. And we have questions sets there on the pandemic, on voting and civic engagement, on race and ethnicity, on Me Too experiences. You can use it to interview someone else or to record your own story. It's audio only, but you can upload a photo with it, and it's kept both on your phone, and then you can submit it to the Jewish Women's Archive to become part of our collection. And the next phase of our oral history work is making our entire oral history collection available and searchable on our site. And so we're very excited to be able to continue recording and sharing oral history and history in general through that, and be able to, bring the public as our partners into that work. So I'm gonna pause there. Most of the stories today that I've shared are from our site. Of course, there's lots of other ways to engage with our content on social media, on our podcast, which is called Can We Talk? Through our virtual programs, we have virtual book talks and oral and online history courses. And we really try to use all of those as ways to engage people in conversation at the intersection of gender, history, and Jewish culture. And, I hope that you can see from some of these are just a few of the thousands of stories that are on our site, a little bit about how looking at women's stories and focusing on them or foregrounding them change the narrative a little bit. So, with someone like Anna Sokolow, we see women as shapers of culture who engage with Jewish tradition and help reinterpret it and introduce it to new audiences. We see women as state builders in the case of Henrietta Szold and Tzipi Porat, who take on new roles and have to negotiate both Jewish identity, national identity, and gender identity. We see women as activists like Rose Schneiderman, who bring new perspectives from the margin and change the direction of a social movement. We see new models of leadership, both in the past that we haven't heard about, we haven't learned about, like Regina Jonas and Asnat Barzani, and also the ways that we're creating them today through contemporary leaders like Sally Priesand, Angela Buchdahl, and Claudia Kramen. We see how those leaders are changing language and liturgy and Torah and how we construct the role of the rabbi and what authority looks like. And I think that if we consider how we place those stories if we were to place those stories at the center, how might we see Judaism and the Jewish community differently? How might we understand our own roles and power differently? How might we understand what it means to make history differently? So I want to close again by returning to the words of Rosa Sonnenschein that I began with: not what has happened, but what is recorded makes history. And so, I feel very proud to be part of the work of recording a new kind of history to change that narrative. I appreciate the work of the National Library of Israel to document history and expand the narrative and make it accessible. And I welcome you to partner with us in raising up Jewish women's voices and experiences, and by sharing your own stories and recording stories of others, so that Jewish women of the future will grow up knowing that their stories and your stories and all of our stories matter. I want to thank you today. And I can certainly post JWA's link right there, as well. Actually, that's not a live link. Let's see here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosenbaum. There are a few questions from the audience. So Ben asked, what happened to Henrietta in 1945?
She was living in Israel. She was going back and forth between Israel and the US, but she was very much aware of the fact that, there were many people who needed to be saved. And so she was, participating in that. And then she was old by that point. So she had withdrawn from her life, and she, she passed away in Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. Rachela asked, does the archive have a broad representation of material about Jewish communities throughout the US? If someone in a particular community, e.g. Chicago, wants to search for material about their community, what is the best way to do that?
So we are not a physical archive, we are a virtual archive. So we don't have collections, we don't have large collections from particular communities. We have, most of our primary material is material that we have curated from various collections in different places and put together to tell particular stories that hadn't been told before. So for local history, unless there are some oral histories that we have in different communities, we've done some oral history projects in Chicago. Those are certainly possible resources, but for local history, I would suggest that you look at your local Jewish historical societies and Federation and synagogue archives, and those usually are the places that will have the richest local histories.
Thank you very much. Josephine wrote, good evening from Malta. Thank you for this fascinating overview of women's silence contribution to history. I wonder if the history of Jewish women is different in any particular way from the women in other communities. And she adds, when I lived in Australia, my union choir sang a song called Bread and Roses, and I had not realized the source of that idea.
Yes, that is a very popular union song that has a long and storied history. So it's such a good question, and I don't know that there's an answer that is globally true in terms of what we can say about Jewish women. I'll say a few things. One is that, and again, this may apply to certain communities more than others, but for example, in Eastern Europe, women often had more access to running businesses because it was a value for men to study. So in traditional communities, it was a value for men to study. And so their wives often took a greater role in business. So that meant that women had the opportunity to develop certain skills that women in other communities at the same time may not have had. So in certain communities, you do see higher rates of literacy among women. I think also there is a certain cultural valorization of both the importance of the home and the home as part of transmitting Jewish culture that gives women a certain role that they then build on. It didn't initially include public religious leadership, but it becomes a stepping stone to that. Ultimately, it becomes a justification for that. And I think also in certain communities, you see a certain, there are ways in which some of the Jewish cultural engagement with questions and with arguing, I think also serves women well in being able to then challenge certain things about their own communities with those skills that they learned, at the table, at school and other places. So I think that some of those threads run through. I mean, as I sort of joked, that piece around fathers who only have daughters teaching their daughters like they would of their sons. There are many important historical figures who had that experience. And so I think that question around education and around wanting to transmit that did sometimes lead to women having more access than they may have in other places.
Thank you very, very much once again, Dr. Rosenbaum. Thank you all for being here with us. I'm going to open the microphone so that anyone who has another question can ask, or if you just want to say thank you and hi. Thank you very much once again, all for being here. Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
And I also just put the link, JWA, as I think I may have said at the beginning, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary and we have a celebration coming up on November 4th. You're welcome to join. There's more information at the link that I just posted there. And I hope everyone will take the opportunity to explore our site. There's so much more. This was just such a teeny tiny taste of the archive. So I hope you will check it out. And if you listen to podcasts, check out our podcast. There's lots of different ways to engage with us.
Dr. Rosenberg, and of course to Doran, thank you very much. Very, very fascinating and very interesting.
Thank you very much.
It was wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you for joining us.